New Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Gregory Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Gregory Mishlove. Today we are going to explore humility as a spiritual practice. With me is Jason Gregory, who is an author and speaker on esoteric subjects, a student of the world's perennial mystical traditions, and author of The Science and Practice of Humility. Welcome, Jason.
It's a pleasure to be on, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah.
You've traveled all over the world. You've studied spiritual traditions of a wide variety, and you found that there's a common element that seems to run through all authentic spiritual traditions.
Well, this is knowledge that's been around for a long time, I guess, the perennial thread that we find in all traditions. But one of the aspects that I focus on in my book is this idea that the masters of all of these traditions, whether that be Buddhism, Hinduism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, or what have you, there's this science of humility that a lot of them live by. And this is more of a way of life as opposed to, the Western idea that we think about enlightenment as a goal or as something to achieve. Mm-hmm. They sort of see it as a way of life, a process that you kind of think about. You think about a dance. What's more important, getting to the end of the dance or enjoying the dance? And this is kind of their process. But the thing is that, the East especially, they don't think in terms of striving or achieving goals or success. So they think in the sense of moving in the moment with the process of life and how that unfolds. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the common thread that I found, that this aspect, this humility, which a master embodies and evokes actually, is something common in all traditions. Mm-hmm. And to explain that a little bit better, when you think about Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, for example, yes, he uses a lot of analogies with water. Mm-hmm. So he says that water seeks the lowest places in nature, but paradoxically is the most powerful force in nature. Mm-hmm. So that's more of an analogy for how we are psychologically. So when we begin to refrain from our opinions, and in Lao Tzu's sense, when we begin to blunt our sharpness, so have rigid opinions about things and people and so forth and so on, we come into this greater power that, we can give it a name, we can call it God, or you can call it infinity, or whatever you want to call it, but we won't give it a name. We'll just say you come into accord or resonance with this higher power, whatever it is, mm-hmm, from living that way. And mm-hmm, that was one aspect of what Lao Tzu himself, and most other Taoist practitioners, and also Buddhist and Hindu and Gnostic and Hermetic, they advocated this way of life, that if you come into accord with that, then you will, in a sense, bring more peace to the world from finding yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, it strikes me that there's a paradox at the heart of all of this. I know, for example, in your writings, you often refer to the snares of the ego as being something really horrible, something, I think you even use the word filthy, that we can fall into.
Yeah. Definitely. It's
sounds very judgmental in a way.
Well, it does. But it's not meant to be seen that way also. Mm-hmm. It's again, the ego or our personality or our persona system can help us evolve and learn certain things about ourselves, but it also can thwart all of our attempts at trying to know at the deeper essence of ourselves. Like, we see this in modern day where most people are stuck to their identity and their belief in themselves. So I sort of say to people that it's not really the ego that's the problem. It's more so the belief in it, the rigid belief in that I am Jason Gregory or you are Gregory Mishlove, and anything outside of that is not welcome. So we, in a sense, because we act from that way, we begin to isolate ourselves from the rest of humanity and the world in general. So I see that as one of the primary problems that we all have as a species, because understanding when we dissolve the ego, or when we reduce or refine our consciousness from having the tendencies of the personality, then we begin to embrace the totality of existence much more, as opposed to being self-interested and keeping it all about yourself.
You know, I had a mentor, Arthur Young, and he was known for saying that it's no good to sacrifice your ego on the altar of spirituality if you haven't developed an ego worthy of being sacrificed.
Well, that's a great saying. It's well, I guess he's right in some sense. If again, in a lot of cultures, if you haven't developed, in a lot of cultures around the world, some of them don't have a rigid persona system as well. Like, so if you look at, for example, India and China, when you look at the oldest systems of the Hindu caste and also Confucianism, the whole idea of their systems was to bring you into the world without the sense of self-interest, bringing you more into the sense of the collective perspective. So you would still have the sense of the identity, but it's not as strong as it would be, say, in the West, where
we're very individualistic.
We're very individualistic. So this is, and you can talk about this culturally, environmentally, how we have evolved. So when you look at, for example, if you look at Greece and China at around the same time of 2000 BC, when you look at the environmental factors of those times, in Greece you had much smaller communities that, hunting, herding and fishing were the primary jobs, the primary source of labor and nourishment. So it was more geared towards smaller communities, more individualistic. When you have a look over in China, there's a focus on massive irrigation systems because we need that. They needed that for rice cultivation. And as you know, and as we all know, with rice cultivation, you and I can't do it on our own. We need, it's intense labor. So from that perspective, they developed naturally, organically, a more collective system, geared more towards social harmony, cultural harmony. It's not to say that what the West did was wrong. I mean, because that was naturally how we evolved. But what we've realized, I guess, over evolution is that to be focused primarily on the individualistic perspective doesn't really help humanity at all. I mean, in its totality.
Well, you talk about an interesting dynamic, Jason, between the warrior and the sage. And if I understand your writing, you suggest we all have within us both of these archetypes.
Yeah. No, we definitely do. I speak in the book about we have two primary states of awareness. So basically the warrior is the individual, I mean, it's us as a human being caught in the details of our own mind or of external circumstances and situations.
Believing that by fighting, in a sense, or engaging in battle, we can make the world a better place somehow.
Yeah. Definitely. And, when we, especially when we observe our own mind, when we have a lot of rigid opinions or beliefs, we begin to act from that. And the warrior, in a sense, because they act from that place, they have their own personal agenda, which usually conflicts with everyone else's agenda. Now, we all have this on a deep, subtle level. The idea in especially the Eastern spiritual traditions, is to begin to refine your consciousness and begin to evolve your state of perception out of that. And that's what we get into more of the sage's state, where the sage can see the details in their own mind and in the world, where they're in struggle, they're in conflict, they're in suffering, but they begin to refrain from believing that that's what they actually believe. So they begin to evolve their perception and see that, as in Buddhism, they say that you need to cleanse your wrong perceptions. So, that can mean anything. That can mean if you are geared, in a sense, very nationalistically, then how does that benefit anyone else? And who's to say that you're right as opposed to someone is wrong? I saw when I was in Philadelphia recently, Pope Francis, there was a quote up and he said, we all have a duty to do good. And I thought, that's all well and good, but good according to who? These are kind of the more deeper philosophical aspects I think that we need to engage in, because if he's referring to good according to him or good according to Catholic Church, that's again the wrong perception of how we should see life.
You suggest that there are 4 major traps that we fall into, identifying with our nation, with our religion, with our sexual or our gender.
Yep. And our race,
And our race.
Yeah. So these are sort of like what I call the 4 pillars of separation. So they kind of distort our awareness of reality as it is.
But there are many ways we can separate ourselves. I might say, as a psychologist or as a parapsychologist, I'm so much better than everyone else.
Well, you can look at it that way.
Well, there are moments, I suppose, when I do feel that way. But fortunately, they're brief moments. I usually get reminded very quickly that other people might just as easily believe I'm worse. And I suppose sometimes people overcompensate for when they're feeling persecuted.
Yeah. Well, they do. And I don't want the listener to think that just because I say it as these four core pillars of separation, it doesn't mean in a sense that they're wrong. Mm-hmm. The problem is the belief in them, the over-identification in them. Like, you could say you're American and I'm Australian, and we're okay with that. But what, if me being Australian was to get in the way of you and I having friendship and this and that, I'm willing to let that go and let that subside.
Well, when you use the word separation, you're actually, as I understand it, referring to a very deep mystical principle or esoteric principle, which is at the very core of our nature. We are one with the totality of the universe.
Definitely. And that's what I refer to as a spiritual plane of consciousness. It's deep down inside Jeffrey, inside myself. We are the entire universe, so to speak, but we're coming on as Jeffrey and as Jason. This is how we are appearing. So below the physicality and the mental sphere, we have this deeper essence within ourselves that unifies us as one. And this is it is a common core teaching of most religions, but it's been distorted and I guess misinterpreted with a lot of religions as well to think of, because when people think of oneness or the one, they think of God as a separate being or something like this, or as a higher power. But we are an aspect of that. I believe that deep down we are all a part of that. And the so-called spiritual goal for all of us is to begin to peel the layers back and to really live from that place. And, a good example of that is in Vedanta, like one of the core philosophies of Hinduism. You have the idea of Atman in Sanskrit and Brahman. And Brahman is the absolute, the ultimate reality.
Yes.
And deep down within you and myself, we have what is Atman. And that doesn't mean a soul. What it means is undifferentiated consciousness. So that means that deep down within you and myself, we have this, and the Atman is the Brahman. So it's the aspect of, not the aspect, it's actually the totality. But most of us, because of the busyness of our lives and because of the distractions in the world, we don't really align with that a lot in our lives. And we're too busy, for example.
Well, and also you suggest, though, that this understanding of the essential oneness is what engenders humility in great spiritual masters, that they can appreciate that there's nothing more perfect or nothing greater than the wholeness, and nothing that we can do to improve it.
No. Well, it's there. It's natural. It's part of us. And I guess with the masters, it's for them, it's just a recognition of it. And it's what differs between them and us mere mortals is they have more of a prolonged state of that, where we might have it only in a divine performance of art or in sport or in, say, if you're writing, you feel it in that moment, that sense of unity within ourselves. But how do we take it out of that sphere into a prolonged state? And so the spiritual masters, what they did was began to, again, refine their consciousness and come into what I call is the great work of eternity, beginning to be sincere with yourself and being humble to existence and blunting in sharpness, not being too opinionated, understanding that, in that humble place, that's where enlightenment is evoked.
As opposed to the warrior spirit. The warrior would look out at the world, and maybe in the best of circumstances, the warrior would say, we have to do something about it because there are problems that we have to solve: pollution, war, disease, poverty, and so on. And a warrior might dedicate their life to solving these problems, but the sage would look at it differently.
Well, what the sage would say is that we're going about it the wrong way, because he's saying, well, they would say, to save the world, you need to save yourself first. And they would also say that the warrior, because they're trying to solve all these problems, what state of perception got us into these problems in the first place? And they would say it's the warrior's state of perception, because it's the agendas and all of this and that goes into having ecological problems, having problems with poverty and so forth and so on.
They're pretty much all man-made.
All man-made, yeah.
Yes.
So that would be what they would try and teach us, is to refrain from that tendency to like in the Yoga Sutras, they say, Patanjali says, to refrain from the gravitational pull of that warrior psychology, and begin to refrain. And it doesn't mean, a lot of people, especially in the world, who sort of dance between spirituality and social anarchism or anything like this. They kind of dance between these two ideas. And they sort of say that, how can that benefit us, if we're not going to do anything about it?
Right.
And, the sage would say that, but you haven't changed yourself first. And the way to go about solving these problems is much more, we could say, metaphysical than it is obvious.
So you're not advocating, for example, trying to do both at the same time, working on yourself and working on the world? Or actually, you're not advocating working on yourself, really, are you?
Well, I'm not advocating either way. It's, again, whatever naturally arises with the individual. It's, when, like I mentioned in the book, when we talk about the warrior and the sage's state of consciousness, these are both parts of the universe that are essential. You need to, well, for example, Jeff, as yourself, Jeffrey, you need to pay the bills, you need to do this and that. These are very detailed activities that have to be done. But the sage would say, that's great, do them, but begin to, have more of the prolonged state of the awareness of what you're doing. You don't need to struggle and suffer. If you got a bill with $2,000 or something like that, you don't have to be all contracted. You can just be in that awareness, pay the bills, and go about your life effortlessly without the sense of suffering.
The other point you make is that I'm not about to achieve enlightenment by striving for it. Yeah.
Well, it's, again, like I mentioned before, it's a different ways of thinking between, especially Western and Eastern thinking, is the idea of, in the West, we seek definite interpretation.
We set goals, and we have a plan of action to achieve our goals, and we work our plan.
Exactly. This is why I always say that the West and the East, the West see the world in nouns, and the East see it in verbs, because they see process, where we see objects and definite interpretations and so forth and so on. But the focuses are completely different. That's why in the West you have a focus on categories and objects, and in the East you have a focus on relationships and context. So there's always this idea of interconnectedness, of process, of, I'm meeting Jeff today for some greater reason, maybe. They're more than what we're doing, So we have to, this is why when someone, for example, goes to a Zen monastery, the Zen master will say, well, ask cleverly, what are you doing here? And they will say, I'm here to seek enlightenment. They will tell you to hit the road, because they don't want you to strive for anything. They're trying to get you out of the striving mind. Yeah.
Well, you write that one of the biggest absurdities is thinking that we can change the world.
Yeah. Well, it is one of the biggest absurdities, because, first of all, change it according to whom? To Jason Gregory, like, God, like, I don't want to change the world for anybody, and the idea that can we really change the world in its totality? Like, if we were to do that, we would also take out the diversity and the beauty of life as well. We wouldn't have different cultures, different nations. We would have one system, which would be more aligned with what the political scientist Francis Fukuyama said, more of the convergent model, where he believes that the whole world is converging, because deep down he thinks we're all Western. And I don't agree with that at all. I think that there's kind of more of an ignorant perspective of looking at it.
Well, let me share something with you. As I was reading and pondering your passage about, how absurd it is to think that we can change the world, I saw an interesting advertisement on television. It was about Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
There's a new movie about to come out about Steve Jobs, and it said, only people who believe that they can change the world are going to.
Yeah.
He's an example. He believed he could change the world, and he did. And that's sort of held up now as a role model.
As a role model, yeah.
Certainly, I think a lot of people see Steve Jobs as a role model. But there's also an interesting story about how he died not long ago, and his very last words to his wife were, "Oh wow," as if he was beholding, some sort of intense spiritual splendor at the moment of his death. So how does that fit into the science and practice of humility?
Well, it's interesting that you said, because, for example, if you get out of the kind of the superficial context of that story of Steve Jobs, what you see is someone. Well, what I see is someone. It's very coherent to the East, where you see that inadvertently he's changing the world from following his what I call dharma.
Yes.
In Sanskrit, which is translates as virtue. It's the same as in Chinese, the Chinese character of de. So basically what that is someone who comes in accord to, as what Joseph Campbell would say, is following your own bliss, the ananda that makes Jeffrey do these interviews. It makes you ponder the universe. This is what makes you feel alive. And what I see, especially in the story of Steve Jobs, is he felt most alive and exploring computers and ways of communicating differently with other people. And this has benefited the world tenfold, I believe. But I don't see that, even though he might have said those things, that he wanted to change the world and this and that. I think that just his actions and who he was, and from following his dharma, his own virtue, he inadvertently changed the world. And that's the idea of dharma means in some sense that you give away your own personal will to come into accord with a much higher will, call it the divine will, where artists experience this, where they have this sense of flow and so forth.
The notion of dharma is very important in this dialogue between the sage and the warrior. I know it comes up in the Bhagavad Gita, the classic story of the warrior and the sage.
Definitely. Well, this is where Krishna is trying to tell Arjuna to go into battle against these.
Krishna being the divine being, who's also a sage. And Arjuna, the warrior.
The warrior, yeah. And so Arjuna is caught in the details. He's going to fight his friends, and
he doesn't want to go into battle.
So Krishna explains to him, there's a Sanskrit word, nishkarma karma, and that means don't be attached to the fruits of your own action. So he's trying to get him to be effortless in his action, to see it from a higher distance, and to follow that will, that dharma, what is being called upon him to act from, and instead of Arjuna as the individual. So that's what the whole process of the Bhagavad Gita is.
It's sort of ironic to me that the culture that gave us the philosophy of nonviolence, ahimsa, that their greatest spiritual treatise is one in which the sage is urging the warrior to go into battle.
Yeah. Well, it's paradoxical, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it seems as if, that paradox is often really at the heart of esoteric journeys.
It is, yeah. Well, that's as we were talking about before, when we talk about process and we talk about getting out of the sense of self, what you have to embrace also is paradox about how things are two-sided. It's not one-sided and definite. It's as one Eastern saying says, it's the universe produces consciousness, and consciousness evokes the universe. It's kind of like that stillness and motion are in a sense paradoxical, but the same. And same with the sage and the warrior. They depend on each other as well. Even the sage depends on the warrior. They have an urge to teach and an urge to inspire. And without that, what would the world be?
And you equate this as well, I believe, with our masculine and feminine nature.
Definitely, yeah. And this is, again, found in the East, where you have the yin and yang polarities, which, again, are the same, but they're just opposite ends of one pole. And the masculine and feminine in esoteric knowledge is basically the masculine is the active, or you could align it to heaven, as in China, or Shiva in India, and the feminine being the receptive, being the more passive, and referred to as Earth, or in China and Shakti in India. So you have this dance between the polarities, not just on the physical plane, but also on the psychological plane.
Water and fire.
Water and fire, yeah.
As well. We began by talking about water and its relationship to humility and to the sage.
Exactly. And that's coming back into, that's why in the Tao Te Ching and also in texts like the Bhagavad Gita and that, they say embrace the feminine aspect of for everybody, coming back into accord with the receptiveness of life, because the reason they advocated more of the feminine as opposed to the masculine, because the world is primarily masculine. And so what they saw was that a lot of people are out there doing this and doing that, and not really from an authentic place within themselves, within their hearts. So.
Well, Jason Gregory, this has been a marvelous discussion. Thank you so much for sharing with me.
Thanks for being. Pleasure to be on, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.